Everyone, I would like to start off with thanking everyone for being here and helping us get this message out. I think I'm going to cover a few different specific cases that we've recently worked that we've linked to subjects on vehicles, either scooters, bicycles, or motorized ATVs and dirt bikes. And then kind of in the end, we can bounce around some questions and some different things so we can share with the community how we can try to improve some of these things. On Sunday the 17th, at the 200 block of Martin Luther King beside one of our Uptown parks, we had a group of young men gathered up that were on bicycles. They were not on their bikes at the time, but they were kind of sitting on the curb area. A gentleman was riding by on his car. They started making comments about this young man's car. He pulls over into a adjacent parking lot, comes over and confronts them. A physical argument starts to happen. Another subject that's later identified as Jermaine Walker pulls a handgun out of his waistband and points it at him. He then, the victim then goes back to his vehicle. He then backs out, comes up towards the road. In between this, another vehicle is stopped in the roadway. During this time, we've got Mr. Makai Al-Fayyad has run up and grabbed a handgun from another individual that handed it to him. He is walking in the roadway with a handgun displayed down to his side, and as the vehicle goes by, he fires 4 shots into the vehicle that's occupied by our victim that's struck in the spine and now looks like he's potentially paralyzed. And the girlfriend was also in the vehicle who was unstruck. At that point, all 4 of those, that whole group of young men all ran back to their bicycles and fled the scene. Officers arrived. We had several witnesses that had recorded some of the incident, and also one of them said that guy right there was involved. He then fled from us. Our officers were able to catch him, take him into custody, and that juvenile was interviewed. He was not one of the shooters or one of the gentlemen that had the handgun, but he was charged as a juvenile and then released back to his family that night. From that evidence of those crimes where Mr. Al-Fayyad and Mr. Walker were both charged, a detective in Freedom Division, Detective Abdullah, contacted our detective and said, hey, I'm looking at something connected with them on one of his cases that had happened on the 10th of April over on Valleydale, where a gentleman was shot inside of a vehicle and his dog was also shot during a confrontation on the road where they pulled up beside him and shot into his vehicle and shot him. From the arrest we made uptown with these gentlemen through the help of our our CRU and our VCAT team was able to knock some doors, which led Mr. Walker's mother to turn him into the intake center. We were able to match up some physical evidence through our crime lab that was able to put some of the casings from the scene of the shooting where the man and his dog were shot and link those back to these young men. So subsequently, Freedom detectives were able to charge both of them for that shooting as well. So that's something that I'm very proud of the work that was done by those detectives and all the officers on the scene and our crime lab and our community partners that were there to be the witnesses for us immediately and say, hey, I have video of this. Without that, we would not have been able to make those identifications so quickly. So that we really appreciate all that continued partnership. And it also allowed us to immediately take action and not only clear and get these young men in custody for this crime, but also get them charged for another crime. One of the concerning things is when we interviewed Mr. Walker, who's 18 years old, we also recovered a handgun with no serial number during that arrest, and he admitted to us that he made it at his house. So now we've got an 18-year-old making firearms in his home that now are being passed around or used or pointed at people throughout the city. So very discouraging, but also something that, we just have to make adjustments and continue to try to change some of this behavior. Well, that's our incident 1, right? So that right there happened on Sunday the 17th. Our officers continuing, as you heard from Lieutenant Fishback, we continue to try to do deliberate enforcement efforts with these kids on bikes that a lot of times were just playing chicken with cars, riding recklessly. A lot of it, wasn't wasn't violent, right? And we've seen a really big uptick of the violence associated with these groups. We had the Parkwood Avenue motorist that struck the kid on a bike, and when he got out to check on him, they beat him up, took his stuff, and took his car. All 4 of those young men were arrested. Several of them were well known by officers as repeat offenders, as juveniles. So on Wednesday of the 20th, our crime reduction unit and patrol guys were actively looking for this type of behavior and witnessed 4 young men on Tryon Street, whipping around on one of the couple of the electronic scooters, doing power slides and stopping in front of vehicles and just being going into oncoming traffic. They try to stop them. They flee. Moments later, a motorist stops and confronts them because of the actions they were doing. One of them, age 12, pulls out what looks to be a handgun and points it at him. The driver immediately retreats back in his vehicle, notifies a police officer he sees on foot uptown, who radios that in. That then escalated things for our officers to actually, if they needed to, pursue the young men, not just try to stop them and get compliance. We were able to get all 4 in custody. They ranged from ages 11, one was 12, a third was 12, and the other one was 15 years old. So now we've got 4 young men on these scooters. We used our real-time crime center to partner with us with camera footage and backtrack where they had went, and our officers were able to recover the firearm that turned out to be a replica airsoft handgun that looked real enough. It even had a serial number on the side of it. And it was, I think the PI was going to look at maybe sending out a picture of that, but it's very, very scary to see such a realistic handgun being pointed by a 12-year-old who is unsupervised at dusk riding around Uptown, displaying that behavior with no parental supervision. All 4 of those young men were charged for under juvenile arrest and brought back to our team office. Their guardians came to our office and met with our detectives and supervisors, and at the outcome of that, all 4 parents were charged with contributing to the delinquency of a minor with citations only, which will allow them to come to court and explain to a judge why we had an 11, 12, and 15-year-old roaming around Uptown unsupervised with that type of activity. That's GS 14-316.1, I think. And one of the things, you know, is really sending a strong message, right? And we saw a very different reaction from the families after they were held accountable. And unfortunately, we would like to educate, right? We would like everybody in the community and through the media to educate each other, to say, I can't let my 11-year-old roam free downtown on a scooter that he shouldn't have access to with a credit card anyway. And then let alone if he's carrying an airsoft gun. You know, even if he shoots at home with airsoft, that's something that as a parent we try to be aware of and control that behavior. But I really want people to understand that we're at a point now where if we need to, we are going to need to start coordinating with our partners with the district attorney and hold parents accountable as well for this type of behavior on such young adults, you know, with their behavior. So that's Wednesday. As that momentum builds, Sergeant Bell with the Central Division came to us and said, you know, with these recent issues with the dirt bikes and motorcycles, because we'd had an incident a week earlier where ATVs were riding uptown and officers tried to stop them, and they didn't stop, but they recognized a couple of the young men and signed warrants on them. So that there were active warrants. One of them still has active warrants on him for that incident, because we just didn't have the aviation unit was tied up on another call, and officers couldn't pursue the ATV just for traffic and reckless driving. So we set up an operation where our bicycle units, our dual sport units, our aviation unit, and our real-time crime center and patrol all combined with the crime reduction units from several parts in the city, and we did an operation on Sunday in the afternoon starting after lunch. Immediately, officers started trying to make traffic stops on two-wheel dirt bikes. They're unregistered, not allowed to be lawfully driven on the road, and they immediately recklessly started to ride away doing wheelies and different activity. Our aviation unit with our pilot and our tactical flight officer were fantastic at that moment because they were able to start tracking and following these reckless drivers around the city. And what we instantly saw was, although a lot of the attention's always Uptown, and I saw him go through Uptown, and they're always Uptown, he was able to see them up in Hidden Valley neighborhood off Rocky River Road. Like, there were groups of dirt bikes and ATVs riding and doing wheelies and burnouts in the street all over the whole city. So they were able to start tracking individuals that they identified committing these crimes, and the officers would try to do a traffic stop, then they would flee. So we continued to track those, and luckily we had we only had one injury for the whole day, and the gentleman cut himself on some briars after he dumped his bike and tried to flee. And we were able to get two men in custody immediately for their behavior. We were able to seize 2 ATVs and 2 motorcycles that day. One of the most concerning events that happened that day is officers were trying to stop a motorcycle, and the driver, while they're trying to stop him, reaches down into a bag. He comes out with a bottle filled with a fluid. It's got a wick in it. He tries to light it as he's driving his motorcycle, and he throws it at our dual sport patrol officers that are on marked CMPD dirt bikes in full uniform that he'd already fled from. So after he throws this Molotov cocktail incendiary device, style device that luckily, for the grace of God, it did not ignite, hits towards their bike, he continues to flee. Officers unfortunately lose sight of him. The helicopter loses him when they were making a turn, and he escaped that night. The relentlessness of our detectives and officers were able to do some immediate investigation and identify him, get a positive ID on him, and his name is Joe Colombo Nguyen, Nguyen. He is a 24-year-old young man that lives in Charlotte, and they were able to secure arrest warrants for 3 counts of assault with deadly weapon on a law enforcement officer, 2 counts for assault with deadly weapon for him trying to strike officers with his dirt bike, and also for the felony flee to elude and to resist. From that, officers last night executed not 1 but 2 search warrants at his residence, and were able to take him into custody, recover clothing, recover the dirt bike that he was fleeing on, and recover some electronic evidence that we hope is going to link back to the Molotov cocktail style device that he threw at us. And 40 pounds plus of marijuana were inside the residence, and over 22 grams of suspected fentanyl were inside the residence. So now we've got a young man who is driving recklessly, recording it on his GoPro on his helmet, active on social media, and even after he fled police, he was seen on social media mocking the police. I think he said, F12, we still outside, and with a middle finger being given to, representatives, law enforcement, and the community, So fortunately, he's been taken into custody late last night. I think detectives got done interviewing him and talking to him after 1 o'clock in the morning, and he is over at the jailhouse right now with first appearance with a judge. And our detectives are going to that hearing, and we've got partnerships with the district attorney's office that I was on the phone with this morning that are going to press to try to keep him where he belongs and keep our community safe by keeping him in custody. So, that right there, I think, is a great example of not, even though we may only think it's a young man doing a wheelie or, just blowing off some steam, there are some people who are very violent. And, during that search warrant last night, they recovered an AR-15 style rifle, a handgun, on top of the trafficking amounts of marijuana and the opioids. So I really think that as a department, our stance is going to be very limited tolerance for this type of behavior. I was very, very proud to watch the voluntariness of all these officers to come in and adjust their schedule for the operation Sunday and give away time from their own families so that they could try to make Charlotte safer. We had a couple bike squads in, we had the dual sports in and the aviation unit in, and I can say that I didn't see a single juvenile or anyone riding a bicycle recklessly anywhere uptown or around as we did these different areas. And I will say that's different than what we've seen as a pattern, right? So I think that the message is getting out there because we are very strict at if we charge someone as a juvenile, we are going to seize their bicycle until it comes time for court. And we are going to ask for the full compliance through the court system to make sure that we change the behavior, right? Like I don't think that, you know, a young man doing a wheelie in the street may not have any intent to do anything harm or hurt anyone else, but I think sometimes it's an education piece that he may not understand the danger he's putting himself in because he's getting clicks on TikTok or YouTube or Snapchat, and everybody loves it, and Instagram. You know, hey, follow me, watch how I almost just collide into a cat's bus because it's going to get me more clicks, but not realizing that not only are they putting themselves in danger, but then when they're putting the public in danger as they ride around. So we ask everyone to share the message, to be respectful of the law with vehicles. If you are going to ride a bicycle or a scooter around uptown, that you follow the rules and the law, and that you continue not to do reckless behavior. And again, I really appreciate everyone showing up here to be able to discuss that. If anyone has any questions.
Yeah, you said either Mr. Walker or his co-defendant made a gun at home?
Yes, Mr. Walker admitted during the interview that he fabricated the gun from one of the kits. So what he was able to do is lawfully purchase a kit that isn't a complete firearm, and then he stated that he then used tools at his house to complete the firearm into a fully operational firearm. As an 18-year-old.
18. Also, is the whole of the issue the wheelies, or is it that the things that they're riding are not street legal? Are they legal at all to be on the street?
I think what happens, right, bicycles are considered vehicles, so lawfully a bicycle can be in the street, right? You see, we have bike lanes. We have brand new bike lanes that the city's invested a lot of money and time for people to enjoy themselves. I think what happens is when you start to ride recklessly and you start to endanger people by doing things that the bike wasn't intended to do, by doing the wheelies and cutting in front of cars and doing power slides and that type of reckless behavior that not only endangers them but also other people, that's where it becomes illegal. But just riding on a bicycle on a city street is not illegal in and of itself.
And what about a dirt bike or ATV?
Dirt bike and ATV is different, right? Because those are unregistered. There are some dirt bikes that have a registration plate and have lights and are street legal. Unfortunately, most of the ones that we see doing this type of behavior are not the ones that have any registration or legal ability to be on the road at all. So they can't be on the road at all.
So
Yes, ma'am.
you mentioned holding parents accountable, and then also mentioned your partnership with the district attorney. But I talked to the district attorney's rep a couple of weeks ago, and they said that they were unaware of the bicycle group and the issues because there's no mechanism in place to search for groups on bicycles who are, you know, involved in crimes. So how are you guys going to work with them to tackle this issue when there doesn't seem to be a mechanism in place to identify these specific groups?
Yeah, and I think you bring up a great point, because what happened is, as we started to get requests from journalists like yourself and others, we started to notice that because sometimes these bikes are seized and the kid is just written for reckless, sometimes they're seized during another crime, sometimes there's just different aspects of how we record that type of crime, that it didn't make it easy for the department to kind of tally up, hey, in the last month, I've been able to charge this many people for this type of behavior. So one of the things we looked at is we've met with our crime analysis unit, and we started to do a spreadsheet, just at least Uptown, right? Because Uptown is kind of the focal point, because it's got the buildings and it's exciting, and we have a lot of bustling nightlife. So one of the things is that now anytime somebody has a charge or anything bike related, we are putting it into a single kind of spreadsheet for the division, so that we can then share that with the district attorney if they need it, but also really for us, and as we get requests that, hey, in the last 3 months how many bicyclists have been charged with this type, bicyclists have been charged with this type of behavior, we'll at least have a more accurate reading moving forward. And I think that is, us starting that a few weeks ago is probably what helped, Lieutenant Fishback gather some of those specific numbers he shared with the group today, so that we can at least try to track these specific offenders, because really we want to change the behavior. I don't need to have officers sitting in juvenile court over a kid driving recklessly on a bicycle. But what we can't have is kids pulling out handguns or look-alike handguns, endangering the public and themselves, because there's no accountability. So I think that the full court press is here pre-summer. It's going to continue, and we're going to, hope that through our community partnerships that we're going to change this behavior.
So this issue itself has been going on for years. This is not something new. So why the focus now? What made you guys start to zero in on this?
I think it's got a violence to it, right? It's got more violence associated with it. We used to get a lot of complaints about kids riding wheelies and disrupting traffic, right? Officers would try to stop them, they would flee, and that's kind of where that went, right? And now we're starting to see these emboldenedness of our younger groups getting more aggressive with people that confront them, and now suddenly we've got weapons being involved, and that's really why we're gonna crank it up on our end with that. Part of that other thing was a lot of the streets were shut down. Some of them were shut down during the pandemic, and different events going on nationally, and it allowed more people to have access to different roads and streets and a bigger platform, and we welcome that as long as it's legal and we can, support that and keep people safe. We're not against kids in expressing themselves in different ways, but as it gets to where it becomes criminally unlawful, we are going to stand with that to keep people safe, including them, even if they don't understand it.
I have 2 more questions for you. You mentioned that you went after charging the parents in one of the circumstances. How long has that been a focus for you guys, or is that something new that you're doing to try to curb this activity?
It's always been there, right? So we've used that as a consistent tool to hold people accountable when we see juvenile activity or delinquent behavior that could have been averted had there been some parent involvement, right? Or a lack of it that leads to charging something like that on a citation, right? So that's not something brand new, but I think it is something that we as a department have to send a strong message that this won't be tolerated. And sometimes telling a 11-year-old you can't do that, or a 12-year-old, hey man, you can't carry an airsoft gun around and point it at people because they're mad because you're driving recklessly in front of them and almost caused an accident, because he's 12. He may or may not understand how dangerous that situation was, where he could have been shot and injured by the man he pointed the gun at. And so I think that by us now saying that accountability is going to go around the whole spectrum of his support structure, that pressure is now not just going to be CMPD asking them to stop, but it's also going to be coming from home. And some of the parents, honestly, some of them are working a couple jobs, they're busy, hey, I'm going to go to my friend's house, but they're actually going uptown. There's circumstances where parents may not have knowledge of what the kids do. And at the end of the day, there's free will. A young man or woman can make a mistake and make bad decisions, but on circumstances where we have evidence to show that could have been averted or that charge fits, we will use it in a citation.
And there's such a focus nationally on these ghost guns right now. Is this one of the first circumstances that you're seeing this, or are you seeing an uptick in people making these guns at home? What are you guys seeing at CMPD?
We have seized quite a few, right? Like I have seen through reading violence around the city, they are starting to pop up at a more frequent rate. But again, a gun with no serial numbers, dangerous just like a gun with a serial number. However it was made doesn't make it any less dangerous for us, but it does create sometimes challenges to backtrack where the origin of the handgun was, like who bought it, where it came from, especially if someone makes one for themselves legally and then it's stolen. It's very hard if there's no identifiers on that handgun, as we talked last week about securing your firearms and vehicles and firearm safety. That's something that is very difficult for us to ever match that gun back to the owner if it's stolen, because it doesn't have distinct numbers usually, unless the gentleman making it puts distinct numbers on it.
actually, if no one has another question, I have one more for you. As of a couple weeks ago, CMPD said that they do not track bicycle thefts. Is it something that you guys are starting to track or have any interest in tracking when it comes to these groups? Because I've heard that they will go out and just steal another one and carry on with the activities that they do.
I just think it's something, right, that we just have to continue to work with the analysts on how we capture the data to search specifically for bicycles being stolen. I can say that 2 weeks ago, we caught 3 young men uptown on bicycles with bolt cutters in their backpack inside our parking decks, whipping in and out, and multiple parking decks, and they were stealing bicycles. They were 12, and 13 years old. And they were not the same young men that we caught on the bird scooters or the electric scooters. So we are continuing to see that trend. As we seize a bike, they try to steal a bike. Or someone does, right, and sells it to them. But it's a constant flow with that. But we do see a lot of that. Like, I think Westover Division sent out some pictures just this week of 4 young men that appear to be juveniles internally that are walking through a parking deck, and they stole bicycles. So I think that's something that, you know, if you own a bicycle or you live in an apartment complex, make sure you have a solid lock. Make sure you know your serial number to your bike, your make, your model, photos of it. You know, be aware of that, because a lot of times we'll stop them on a, you know, we'll find your bike, but we can't match it to you and get it back to you if you don't know that information. So I think that's something. One of the other things I forgot to mention earlier is we are exploring options too with the electronic scooter manufacturers, just to see if there's any options we can do. Like when you rent those things, click here and confirm your